One decision, one night, and the greatest general in history lost everything. Candlelight flickered in the cavernous study of the Tuileries Palace, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to mock the stillness of the early summer night in 1812. The air was thick with the scent of melting wax and old paper, a heavy atmosphere that clung to the room's lone occupant. Napoleon Bonaparte stood over a vast oak table, his hands, usually so restless and commanding, now resting flat upon a map unfurled before him. The cartographic expanse of the Russian Empire sprawled under his palms, a vast, blank wilderness of green and beige that stretched into an intimidating unknown east. His face, illuminated by the guttering flame of a single candelabra, was a mask of imperial certainty, every line etched with the unshakable conviction of a man who had bent a continent to his will. He had conquered Italy, humbled Austria, Prussia, and made kings of his brothers. The very furniture in the room seemed to bow to his presence, the gilded frames holding portraits of past French monarchs now serving as silent witnesses to a new, more potent form of power. Yet, on this night, the ghosts of those advisers who had dared to speak against him seemed to linger in the shadows. He could almost hear the echo of Caulaincourt's urgent, desperate warnings about the Russian winter, a cold so profound it could snap a sword blade. He could feel the phantom presence of maps detailing the impossible vastness of the territory, the scorched earth tactics of a people who would rather burn their own homes than see them occupied. But these were whispers, drowned out by the thunderous applause of his own ambition. Pride was the fuel that heated his blood, a roaring fire that the cautious words of lesser men could not extinguish. It was not merely a war he was planning. It was the final, definitive act that would force the Tsar to his knees and secure his continental system, cementing his legacy as the undisputed master of Europe. To hesitate now would be to admit fallibility, a concept foreign to the man who saw himself as a force of destiny. A low rumble of distant thunder rolled over Paris, a portentous growl that made the candle flames shiver. Napoleon did not look up. His focus was absolute, his gaze fixed on the river Niemen, the proposed gateway to his triumph. He reached for the quill, its nib gleaming like a tiny polished weapon. The silence in the room was profound, broken only by the soft scratch of ink on parchment as he signed his name with a swift, decisive flourish. The order was given. The invasion of Russia was set in motion. He straightened up, rolling the tension from his shoulders, and walked to the tall window. The city slept, unaware of the cataclysm its emperor had just unleashed. He saw not the sleeping Parisians, but the spectral ranks of his Grande Armée, 600,000 strong, marching in perfect, glorious order. He saw victory parades through snow-covered streets that did not yet exist in his mind. In that solitary reflection, surrounded by the trappings of his power, hubris and fate intertwined, one feeding the other in a deadly spiral. The candle on his desk flickered one last time, its light catching the fresh, dark ink of his signature, a signature that would seal the doom of 500,000 men and shatter an empire, all born from the fatal certainty of a single, solitary night. The sprawling encampments of the Grande Armée were a city unto themselves, a pulsating, restless organism of men and steel that sprawled across the European landscape in the months before the march east. From the banks of the Elbe to the plains of Poland, the air hummed with the industry of impending war. The rhythmic clang of blacksmiths' hammers on musket barrels and cannon wheels was a constant, percussive anthem. The scent of baking bread from field ovens, of oiled leather, and of unwashed humanity created a thick, potent atmosphere of raw power. Over 600,000 souls, Frenchmen, Italians, Poles, Germans, drawn from every corner of Napoleon's empire, were being forged into a single colossal weapon, its tip aimed squarely at the heart of Russia. At the center of this maelstrom, Napoleon moved with the brisk, untroubled confidence of a master architect surveying his nearly completed masterpiece. He reviewed endless parades, a sea of blue-coated infantry and gleaming cuirassiers flowing past his command post in perfect, disciplined lines. His presence electrified the ranks. A raised hand, a brief approving nod, was enough to send waves of fervent loyalty rippling through the multitude. He saw not the logistical nightmare of feeding such a host, nor the fragile loyalties of his conscripted allies. He saw only invincibility, a numerical and martial supremacy so overwhelming that the mere sight of it would force Tsar Alexander I to capitulate before a single shot was fired in earnest. Among his marshals, this confidence was mirrored with fierce devotion. Michel Ney, the bravest of the brave, rode at the emperor's side, his red hair like a banner. His loyalty was a simple, unshakable creed, his faith in Napoleon's star absolute. He saw the coming campaign not as a gamble, but as the next glorious chapter in an unbroken saga of victory, another laurel to be placed upon the brow of France. In contrast, the calculating eyes of Talleyrand, the Prince of Benevento, watched from the gilded corridors of power in Paris. Where Napoleon saw destiny, Talleyrand saw only folly. He observed the diplomatic exchanges with Russia deteriorate into a theater of insults and obstinacy, his silent doubts festering into a cold, certain dread. He understood the nature of the Russian bear, its vastness, its resilience, its willingness to retreat into its own immense, unforgiving hinterland, drawing an enemy in to be consumed by the land itself. Despite the surface spectacle of unity and strength, cracks were already appearing, subtle fissures in the grand facade. Seasoned quartermasters studied their supply ledgers with furrowed brows, their calculations revealing a terrifying shortfall in wagons, grain, and fodder for the vast cavalry divisions. The sheer scale of the army was its own greatest enemy, a monster that would need to devour entire nations to sustain its march. Whispers circulated among the veteran sergeants, men who had fought in the snows of Prussia and Austria. They spoke of a different kind of cold in the East, a deep, silent killer that respected no empire and no emperor. They spoke of a people who worshipped a god of the soil and the snow, a people who would not break, but would simply fade back into their endless forests and fields, leaving only ashes for the invaders to claim. The mood was a taut wire, strung between the gilded confidence of the command tents and the grim, practical anxieties of the campfires. It was a tension born of overconfidence clashing with unspoken fear, of ambition straining against the immutable laws of geography and climate. Napoleon, enthroned at the center of his martial universe, felt only the gathering momentum of his own will, a storm of his own creation. He could not, or would not, hear the distant, first whispers of the winter wind, or see the shadow of the coming retreat already falling across the sun-drenched fields of Poland. The storm was gathering, and he was its proud, unblinking eye. The first pontoon bridge groaned under the weight of destiny, a fragile artery of wood and rope stretched across the swift gray waters of the Niemen River. Dawn on the 24th of June, 1812, bled a pale, watery light over the gathered host, illuminating the greatest military force Europe had ever seen. A forest of bayonets glittered in the nascent sun, and the air vibrated with the jingle of harnesses, the tramp of countless boots, and the low, eager murmur of 500,000 men. From a low hillock, Napoleon watched the crossing begin. A small, immaculate figure on a white horse, his hand resting on his thigh. He saw not a river, but a threshold. The Niemen was the Rubicon of the East, and he was crossing it without a backward glance. The initial surge of the army was a spectacle of raw power, a flood of blue and green uniforms pouring into the Russian Empire with the unstoppable force of a tidal wave. Regimental bands played, and eagles, held high, caught the light, symbols of an invincibility that felt, in that moment, as tangible as the earth beneath their feet. That feeling of triumphant invasion began to curdle before the sun had reached its zenith. Beyond the riverbank, the land unfolded not as a welcoming conquest, but as a vast, silent emptiness. The roads, which they had expected to be choked with fleeing peasants or defending troops, were deserted. The first villages they encountered were not just quiet, they were hollowed-out shells. Doors swung on broken hinges, revealing single rooms stripped bare. Hearth fires were cold, the ashes days old. Wells had been fouled with carcasses of livestock. The Russian earth itself seemed to have swallowed its people, leaving behind only the ghost of their presence and the stark, unsettling strategy of scorched earth. The fertile plains they had marched through in Poland gave way to an immense rolling landscape of birch forests and scrubland that stretched to a hazy, indistinguishable horizon, a panorama that offered no landmarks for the soul, only a profound and growing sense of exposure. Among the junior officers and the rank-and-file soldiers, the enthusiastic chatter of the morning died away, replaced by a watchful, uneasy silence. Men who had joked about being in Moscow by autumn now scanned the tree lines with nervous eyes, their hands resting a little more tightly on their muskets. The sheer nothingness was more unnerving than the sight of an enemy army. There were no glorious charges to be made, no fortifications to storm, only this vast, indifferent country that seemed to recede before them with every step. They were an army marching into a void, and the silence was a heavier burden than any pack. The landscape itself felt complicit, the endless sky a pale, watchful eye, the whispering birch leaves seeming to speak in a language of warning they could not understand. Napoleon, however, rode at the head of this creeping disquiet with an expression of serene satisfaction. He interpreted the emptiness not as a terrifying tactic, but as a sign of Russian weakness and fear. To him, the abandoned villages were proof that the Tsar's forces were in full, disorganized retreat, incapable of facing his Grande Armée in open battle. He dictated swift, confident dispatches back to Paris, speaking of a successful entry and a demoralized foe. His arrogance was a shield against the creeping dread that infected his men, a blindness born of a decade of unprecedented victory. He could not see that the very land was turning against him, that each empty mile was a strand in a net being deliberately woven. The worries of his junior officers, men who saw the dwindling supplies and the tired, bewildered faces of their troops, were mere whispers lost in the wind of his certitude. They saw the first cracks in the grand enterprise. He saw only the unbroken path to a destiny he was certain to claim, marching his magnificent army ever deeper into the waiting, silent trap of the Russian hinterland. The land itself became the enemy. The initial triumphant surge across the Niemen had dissolved into a grueling, monotonous trudge eastward, a slow, grinding consumption of men and miles under the oppressive dome of the Russian summer sky. The sun, a great white, merciless eye, beat down upon the Grande Armée, turning the dusty tracks into choking clouds of fine powder that coated lungs, clogged muskets, and gritted between teeth. The vastness that had at first been unsettling now became a logistical nightmare, a yawning chasm between the army and its lifelines. Supply wagons, strung out over dozens of miles of poor roads, became hopelessly bogged down or simply never arrived, their precious cargoes of flour, salt, and brandy plundered by desperate stragglers or rotting in the heat. The army was a monstrous serpent, its head pushing ever forward while its tail starved and withered. Napoleon, ensconced in his traveling headquarters, pushed his men with a relentless, almost mechanical drive. Each day's march was a predetermined number of versts on a map, a calculation that ignored the reality of heatstroke, dysentery, and exhaustion. He saw the dwindling numbers on his morning reports not as a catastrophe in the making, but as the inevitable attrition of a campaigning season, the necessary price of glory. Advisers who dared to mention the faltering supply trains or the spreading sickness were met with a cold, dismissive stare. His ambition was a furnace that burned too hot to feel the chill of reality. The mirage of a decisive battle, of the Tsar's surrender in Moscow, shimmered always just beyond the next line of trees, blinding him to the disintegration of his own force. In the ranks, the grand enterprise of conquering Russia shrunk to the intimate, desperate scale of survival. One evening, a young soldier from Normandy, his uniform faded and tattered, hunched over a scrap of paper in the flickering light of a campfire. His fingers, stained with dirt and powder, struggled to form the letters. He wrote of the strange, vast emptiness, of the heat that was so different from the gentle sun of home, of the gnawing hunger that had become a constant companion. He did not write of the friend who had collapsed from fever that morning, left by the roadside because there were no wagons for the sick. He wrote instead of the cherries in his mother's orchard, the coolness of the village stream, crafting a fiction of well-being to shield those he loved from the truth of this slow, grinding consumption. He sealed the letter with a bit of wax, a tiny, fragile vessel of hope that he knew, in his heart, would likely never cross the 1,000 miles back to France. Later that night, in the stuffy confines of a command tent, the maps illuminated by a single lantern, a different kind of truth was being whispered. Marshal Ney, his face etched with a fatigue no sleep could cure, stood with the senior general. The older man, a veteran of a dozen campaigns, stared at the vast blank spaces on the map representing the land ahead, his voice a low, conspiratorial murmur. He spoke of the phantom Russian army that shadowed them, always just out of reach, burning the stores and bridges they so desperately needed. He spoke of the whispers from captured Cossack scouts, who laughed and said the real general of Russia was General Winter. Ney listened, his jaw tight, his own fierce loyalty warring with the cold, creeping dread that the general's words made tangible. This was not war as they knew it. It was a slow, deliberate bleeding, an ambition colliding with an immovable, indifferent reality. And still the march continued, a river of blue flowing into the endless green and brown of the Russian plain. The elusive Russian tactics were a constant gnawing open loop. Where were they? When would they stand and fight? The questions hung in the dusty air, unanswered, feeding a collective anxiety that was as debilitating as any disease. The Grande Armée was no longer an invincible force. It was a weary, hungry, and sickly multitude, driven forward by the iron will of one man, marching deeper into a trap whose jaws were not made of steel, but of distance, hunger, and the coming inevitable turn of the seasons. The dawn of September 7th did not break so much as it ignited, a blood-red smear across the eastern sky that promised a day of fire and iron. Before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, the world erupted. 1,000 French cannon spoke as one, their thunderous chorus ripping the morning. Silenced to shreds. Great geysers of earth and splintered wood fountained into the air along the Russian lines, a man-made storm of destruction that churned the fields around the village of Borodino into a scarred, smoking morass. The acrid scent of gunpowder, thick and suffocating, blanketed the land, a metallic taste that coated the throats of the waiting men. This was the battle Napoleon had craved, the decisive confrontation that would shatter the Russian army and open the road to Moscow. But the field before him was not a chessboard, it was a slaughterhouse in the making. Wave after wave of blue-coated infantry advanced into the maelstrom, their disciplined lines dissolving into chaos as round shot and grape shot tore through their ranks. Men vanished in pink mists, their comrades stumbling over the mangled remains. The deep-throated roar of the Grand Battery was answered by the sharper crack of Russian artillery from the fortified redoubts that dotted the landscape. The Great Redoubt and the Bagration fletches became focal points of the carnage, earthworks transformed into abattoirs where French and Russian soldiers clashed in a desperate hand-to-hand frenzy. Bayonets flashed, sabers rose and fell, and the ground grew slick with blood and entrails. Cavalry charges, those magnificent, terrifying spectacles of war, surged forward in glittering waves of cuirassiers and Polish lancers, only to be met by countercharges of Russian hussars and Cossacks. The ensuing melee a swirling, chaotic vortex of slashing steel and screaming horses. From his command post on the Borodino redoubt, Napoleon watched the ebb and flow of the battle through a haze of smoke and his own mounting malaise. A heavy cold had settled in his chest, and a strange, uncharacteristic lassitude seemed to weigh upon his shoulders. His marshals, their faces grimed with powder and urgency, pleaded with him. The old guard, his elite, uncommitted reserve, stood in pristine formation behind him, 20,000 of his best soldiers, a hammer that could shatter the Russian center, which was buckling but had not broken. Send in the guard, they urged. Break them now, and the day is ours. But the emperor hesitated. His gaze, usually so sharp and penetrating, was clouded. To commit the guard was to risk his final personal insurance, the very symbol of his power. He saw not a decisive opportunity, but a potential gamble. The moment stretched, the precious seconds ticking by as the battle hung in a bloody, precarious balance. It was a mistake born of sickness and a flicker of unspoken doubt, a pivotal hesitation that would grant the Russians the time they needed to reinforce their lines and turn a potential rout into a stalemate. Across the field, the human cost of that stalemate was written in flesh and bone. A young French drummer boy, no more than 14, lay dying beside his shattered drum, his life seeping into the Russian soil far from the lavender fields of Provence. Nearby, a veteran of Austerlitz, a man who had seen the sun rise over a dozen battlefields, cradled the head of a dying comrade, his own face a mask of grime and despair as he watched the light fade from his friend's eyes. There was no glory here, only the brutal mechanical work of death. The air was thick with the screams of the wounded, a horrifying chorus that rose above the din of cannonade, a sound that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their days. The bravery was undeniable, acts of sublime courage performed in the midst of utter horror, but it was a bravery expended for a few yards of bloody ground, then lost again in a Russian counterattack. As the September sun began its descent, casting long, grotesque shadows across the field, the firing slowly sputtered into an exhausted, mutual ceasefire. The Battle of Borodino was over. No decisive victory had been won. The Russian army, mauled and bleeding, withdrew in good order, its spirit unbroken. The French held the field, a hollow, Pyrrhic claim. They were the masters of a landscape of the dead, a silent plain littered with over 70,000 corpses and maimed men. The silence that fell was more terrible than the noise of battle, broken only by the moans of the wounded and the crackle of burning grass. Napoleon surveyed the carnage, the stench of blood and smoke filling his nostrils. He had gotten his great battle, but in the gathering twilight, surrounded by the staggering scale of his loss, the first cold tendrils of a terrible realization began to coil around his heart. This was not the prelude to victory. It was the bloody, costly foreshadowing of a campaign's ultimate catastrophic failure. The silence was the first betrayal. After the thunder of Borodino, after the long anticipatory march along the Smolensk road, Napoleon had expected a capital in chaos, a city awaiting its conqueror with the fearful clamor of surrender. Instead, on the 14th of September, he rode through the gates of Moscow, to a profound and unnatural quiet, broken only by the plodding hooves of his horse and the weary tread of his vanguard. The streets were empty, the windows of the ornate onion-domed houses shuttered and blind. No officials came forward with the keys to the city, no priests with icons to bless his entry, no populace to stare in awe or terror at the Emperor of the West. Moscow, the holy city, the ancient heart of Russia, was a beautiful, painted corpse. Then came the smoke. At first it was just faint dark smudges against the pale blue of the autumn sky, rising from different quarters of the city. But as the afternoon wore on, the smudges coalesced into a great bruised purple pall that began to swallow the sun. The air, once crisp, grew thick with the acrid scent of burning pine and hemp, of smoldering silk and scorched grain. Fires, set by Russian patriots and freed criminals on the orders of Governor Rostopchin, began to join together, their separate hungers merging into one roaring, city-consuming inferno. The sky itself seemed to burn, a mirror to the shock and rage that ignited within Napoleon as he stood on the steps of the Kremlin. The magnificent panorama of the city, which he had expected to be the backdrop for his greatest diplomatic triumph, was now a vista of hell, the flames painting his face in flickering oranges and reds. This was not a conquest, it was a calculated, contemptuous insult, a city sacrifice to deny him its spoils. He took up residence within the fortified walls of the Kremlin, its ancient crenellated towers a supposed bastion of safety in the maelstrom. From his chambers he watched the city burn. The wind howled, a furnace breath whipping the flames into towering whirlwinds that leaped from street to street, consuming wooden mansions and merchant stalls with indiscriminate fury. The crackle and roar were a constant maddening soundtrack to his isolation. He paced the ornate halls, his boots echoing on the polished floors, his mind racing over the colossal miscalculation. He had gambled everything on the Russian soul being like any other, pragmatic, self-interested, eager for peace after a show of force. He had believed that the capture of their spiritual capital would break their will. Instead, they had broken the city itself, revealing a terrifying, fanatical resolve that valued national pride above all earthly possessions. The irony was a bitter poison in his mouth. He, the master of Europe, was the emperor of ashes, the ruler of smoke and silence. For 5 weeks he waited in the burned-out shell of Moscow, a prisoner of his own pride and a strategy that had catastrophically failed. He dispatched letter after letter to Tsar Alexander, proposing peace, offering terms, expecting the logic of his position to eventually compel a response. No answer ever came. The silence from St. Petersburg was more deafening than the roar of the flames had been. Each day, the emptiness of the city pressed in on him, the vast, hollowed-out spaces of physical manifestation of the void in his grand design. The only citizens left were the dead and a few desperate looters, ghosts in a kingdom of his own making. He had crossed a continent to grasp a shadow, and in the cold, clear light of the Russian autumn, with the scent of smoke permanently woven into his clothes, Napoleon was forced to stare into the abyss of his own fallibility, a truth more devastating than any defeat in battle. The first snowflake was a whisper of doom, a single, perfect, six-pointed star of white that drifted past the soot-stained window of the Kremlin and settled on the stone sill. It did not melt. It lay there, a tiny, crystalline accusation against the grime, a harbinger of the death that rode on the wind. For 35 days, Napoleon had waited in the corpse of Moscow, pacing the ashes of his ambition, his eyes fixed on the eastern road for the courier from St. Petersburg who never came. The silence from Tsar Alexander was a more profound defeat than any battlefield loss. It was a void that swallowed his ultimatums, his offers, his very logic. The peace he had expected to dictate from the heart of a conquered empire was a phantom, and the reality was the creeping cold and the dwindling supplies of his starving, demoralized army. The council of war was held in a chamber whose gilded opulence was a cruel mockery of their predicament. The marshals and advisors stood around a map, their faces gaunt, their uniforms stained and worn. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and fear. Murat, the flamboyant cavalry king, spoke with uncharacteristic grimness, his gestures sharp with urgency. He detailed the Cossack bands that grew bolder with each passing day, the reports of partisans harrying their supply lines, the utter impossibility of wintering in a burned-out city with no food. Berthier, the loyal chief of staff, pointed a trembling finger at the calendar. It was the 18th of October. Every day of delay was a sentence of death for thousands of men. Their pleas were a unified, desperate chorus. They must retreat, and they must begin now before the full fury of the Russian winter was upon them. Napoleon stood apart from them, his back to the room, staring out at the gray, lowering sky. Another snowflake fell, then another, a sparse, tentative vanguard of the storm to come. He could feel the weight of their stares, the collective dread pressing against his will. But a deeper, more stubborn force held him in place, his pride. To order a retreat was to admit, before all of Europe, that his great gamble had failed. It was to transform his triumphant march into a desperate flight, to etch the word defeat onto a campaign that bore his name. He argued for one more day, then another, clinging to the forlorn hope that the Tsar would yet blink, that some political miracle in St. Petersburg would deliver him from this humiliation. His isolation in that moment was absolute. He was no longer the first among brilliant marshals, but a solitary figure besieged by the immutable facts of geography and climate, his legendary will clashing against a force that would not yield. Throughout the occupied ruins of the city, the army felt the turn of fate in its bones. The sight of the snow, so gentle and innocent, sent a deeper chill through the ranks than any frost. Men huddled around meager fires fueled by splintered furniture, their breath blooming in the air, their eyes hollow. They spoke in low tones of home, of warm hearths and full bellies, memories that were becoming as distant and mythical as the victory they had been promised. The dread was a physical presence, a cold stone in every gut. They had followed their emperor to the ends of the earth, and now the earth itself was preparing to kill them. Officers watched their men with pity and a shared terror, knowing the order to march west would not be a deliverance, but the start of a race against an enemy more pitiless than any Russian. Army, the coming winner. Finally, on the morning of the 19th of October, the order was given. There was no fanfare, no stirring proclamation. The command went out in terse, functional phrases. The Grande Armée would abandon Moscow and begin the retreat to Smolensk. As the first units formed up in the slushy streets, the mood was not one of relief, but of grim resignation. The great retreat had begun, not with a bang, but with the soft, deadly whisper of falling snow. Napoleon mounted his horse, his face a stony mask, and took one last look at the blackened spires of the Kremlin. He was leaving behind not just a city, but the last vestige of his invincibility. The turn of fate was complete. The conqueror had become the fugitive, and the vast, white, silent landscape of Russia waited to exact its price. The retreat began not as a march, but as a slow, agonizing uncoiling of a dying beast. The Grande Armée, once a sleek instrument of conquest, now bled stragglers with every laborious step it took away from the ashes of Moscow. The world had been stripped of color, reduced to a monochrome nightmare of white snow under a lid of leaden gray sky. The cold was not merely an absence of heat. It was a predatory presence, a silent crystalline entity that seeped through wool and leather to gnaw at the marrow. It stole the warmth from a man's breath as it left his lips, frosting beards and mustaches into icy masks. It made the air itself feel brittle, as if a sudden shout might shatter the world into a million glittering shards. Men moved in a shambling, hypnotized trance, their bodies bent against the relentless wind that scoured the exposed road to Smolensk. Their uniforms, once proud symbols of imperial might, were now ragged frozen shrouds. Discipline, the iron spine of Napoleon's army, crumbled faster than a snowbank in a thaw. Soldiers who had stood unflinching before volleys of musketry now whimpered like children, their minds broken by the endless white hell. Some simply sat down by the roadside, a vacant look in their eyes, and did not get up again. They became statues of ice, their final, resigned postures preserved by the very element that killed them, macabre milestones marking the path of the retreat. Horses, their ribs stark against their frozen hides, staggered and fell, their great suffering eyes glazing over. The road became a charnel path, littered with the frozen carcasses of men and beasts, their forms soon buried under the drifting snow, only to be partially exposed again by the shuffling feet of those who came after, a grisly testament to the army's dissolution. Through this landscape of despair, Napoleon rode, a spectral figure wrapped in a heavy gray coat. His presence, which had once commanded instant obedience and adulation, now drew only hollow, resentful stares. He tried to rally them, moving among the columns, his words of encouragement snatched away by the howling wind. But the magic was gone. The aura of invincibility had been extinguished, not by a rival general, but by the frost. Men saw not their emperor, but the author of their misery. When he ordered the few remaining cannons spiked and abandoned for lack of horses to pull them, it was not seen as a necessary sacrifice, but as a surrender of their very strength. His authority, once absolute, now lay fractured on the frozen ground, as brittle as the ice coating the dead men's faces. The Cossacks were the wolves to this winter's bear. They materialized from the swirling veils of snow on their shaggy ponies, silent and swift, their forms seeming to blend with the storm. They did not seek pitched battles. They harried, they slashed, they vanished. A sudden blood-curdling whoop would echo from the tree line, followed by a flight of arrows or a pistol shot, and another handful of stragglers would fall, their blood a shocking brief scarlet on the snow before the storm covered them. The attacks were a constant, nerve-shredding torment picking at the edges of the collapsing army, ensuring there was no rest, no respite. The suffering was absolute, a perfect triangle of agony, the cold that froze the body, the hunger that gnawed the gut, and the Cossacks who preyed on the spirit. Survival became the only remaining objective, a desperate, open question that hung in the frozen air, its answer written in the deepening snow and the dwindling numbers of those still left to ask it. The veneer of civilization, worn thin by weeks of cold and hunger, finally shattered. The hunger was no longer a gnawing emptiness, but a sharp-toothed beast that devoured reason and morality. Around the meager, smokeless fires that offered no warmth, men's eyes began to linger too long on their weaker comrades. The first instance was a furtive, shameful thing, done in the deep of night, far from the main column. A small group of stragglers, their minds unraveled by starvation, fell upon a fallen horse. But when the last stringy morsels were gone, their desperate gazes turned elsewhere. The whispers began, tales of camps where men vanished, and the stew pots held a meat that was too pale, too strangely jointed. The horror of cannibalism spread through the ranks, not as a shouted condemnation, but as a silent, chilling understanding. It was the final admission that they were no longer an army, nor even men, but merely animals fighting for one more day in a world of white death. Desertion, once a capital offense, became a rational calculation. Small groups, sometimes just 2 or 3 men, would peel away from the column under cover of a snow squall, hoping to take their chances with the land rather than the certain death of the march. Some sought surrender with the Cossacks, a desperate gamble for a crust of black bread. Most simply wandered into the birch forests, their footprints filling with snow behind them, becoming just more ghosts in the frozen silence. The army was dissolving, its cohesion melting away like snow on a warm hand. The Grande Armée was becoming a scattered, leaderless mob, each man a solitary island of suffering in an endless white sea. The ultimate trial awaited them at the Berezina River. The broad, ice-choked waterway was a snarling barrier, its banks a churned morass of half-frozen mud. Russian forces under Chichagov held the far side, their artillery positions clearly visible on the high ground. The bridges were destroyed. For a moment, complete annihilation seemed inevitable, the remnants of the Grande Armée trapped between the river and the pursuing armies of Kutuzov. But in this nadir, a flicker of the old military genius remained. Through a desperate, brilliant feint, French engineers managed to throw 2 fragile pontoon bridges across the raging, ice-clogged current. For 3 days and nights, a relentless, chaotic torrent of humanity squeezed across those trembling structures. Men fought and died in the press, trampled underfoot or shoved from the crowded planks into the freezing black water to be swept away. The Russian guns poured shot and shell into the mass, turning the crossing into a slaughterhouse. The bridges, slick with blood and ice, became the final horrific bottleneck of the retreat, a place where thousands perished not for glory, but for a few feet of precarious wood. It was here, amidst the screams and the thunder of cannonade, that a young drummer boy, his face still round with youth, tried to rally a scattering group of infantry, with a faltering beat on his ice-rhymed drum. A Russian cannonball fired at long range tore through the ranks. It did not explode, but its passage was a scythe. The boy was thrown backward, his drum shattered, his small body broken against the frozen earth. He lay still, the last silent beat of his life lost in the cacophony. Nearby, a grizzled veteran of the Italian campaigns, a man who had seen the pyramids and the son of Austerlitz, watched the boy die. He looked down at his own trembling, frost-bitten hands, then at the panicked, broken men around him, and then across the river at the implacable Russian guns. He was not seeing the Berezina, but the glittering waters of the Nile, the perfect lines of his regiment on a sun-drenched field. The empire he had helped build, the glory he had fought for, had been reduced to this, a bloody scramble across a frozen river, its fragility laid bare in the death of a child and the despair of an old soldier. Into this scene of absolute catastrophe, a courier, half dead himself, finally fought his way to Napoleon's side. The message he carried was not from the Russian front, but from Paris. It spoke of a failed coup, of malcontents and former allies sensing weakness, of the brittle foundations of his empire cracking under the news of the disaster in Russia. As Napoleon read the dispatch, his face, already etched with the strain of the retreat, seemed to collapse in upon itself. The despair that had been lapping at the edges of his consciousness now flooded in. He was not just losing an army. He was losing everything. He stood on the riverbank, the architect of a frozen hell, watching his legacy and the lives of the men who had trusted him, being swept away by the icy, indifferent waters of the Berezina. The tent was a frail pocket of warmth in an empire of ice, its canvas walls trembling with each gust of wind that screamed down from the Arctic north. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of damp wool, cold sweat, and the faint, greasy scent of a single tallow candle struggling against the pervasive gloom. Napoleon Bonaparte sat alone on a campaign stool, a fur-lined greatcoat drawn tight around his shoulders, yet still he shivered. It was a deep cellular tremor that no fire could ever hope to reach. Before him, on a makeshift table of ammunition crates, lay a leather portfolio, its contents a litany of disaster. These were the latest dispatches, the final damning reports from a retreat that had become a funeral procession. His hands, pale and strangely delicate in the flickering light, rested upon them, not with the grip of a commander, but with the weary touch of a man laying a corpse to rest. His mind, fevered with exhaustion, drifted back through the years, across the snows of Russia to a different kind of frost, the bright, crisp hoarfrost of the Austerlitz dawn. He could feel it again, the electric thrill that had coursed through him as he stood on the Zuran hill, the sun of Austerlitz breaking through the mist to illuminate his perfect trap. Below, the combined armies of Austria and Russia were being shattered, their ranks broken and fleeing across the frozen ponds. The cheers of his men had been a physical force, a wave of adulation that warmed him against the winter chill. He had been the master of fate then, a genius whose every calculation was confirmed by victory. The memory was so vivid he could almost hear the triumphant roar, see the captured eagles held high. But the vision shattered against the present reality, the moan of the wind, the distant, hopeless cry of a soldier outside his tent. Austerlitz was a ghost, and its brilliance only made the darkness of now more absolute. With a sudden, violent motion, he swept the dispatches into a pile. He took the candle, its flame guttering wildly, and held it to the corner of the topmost page. The paper, dry and brittle, caught immediately, the flame racing hungrily across the inked words that detailed regiments annihilated, guns lost, men frozen into grotesque statues. He fed the fire page by page, watching as the evidence of his failure curled into black ash and floated upward. The reports spoke of supply trains that never arrived, of bridges of corpses across the Berezina, of marshals who could no longer control their men. He was burning the truth, an attempt to hide the scale of the disaster from the eyes of history, and perhaps from himself. Each glowing ember was a symbol of his fallen pride, a desperate, futile act of a man trying to control. A narrative that had already spiraled far beyond his command. The fire was a tiny, inadequate pyre for 500,000 lives, its heat a fleeting mockery of the cold that was consuming his soul. When the last page was gone, he sat in the near darkness, the candle nearly spent. The silence in the tent was a heavy weight. He was utterly alone. His marshals were scattered, fighting their own desperate battles for survival. His army was a phantom. Here, in this frozen tent at the edge of the world, the grand themes of leadership and failure were stripped to their barest essence. Leadership was not about grand strategies on a map. It was about the promise of survival you could not keep. Failure was not a tactical error. It was the cold that seeped into the bones of the men who had trusted you, the hollow eyes of the starving, the knowledge that your ambition had been the instrument of their destruction. He was not just a general who had lost a campaign. He was a man who had led a nation's sons into a grave of ice, and the weight of that knowledge was a colder, heavier burden than any winter coat could bear. He stared into the dying flame, a solitary emperor in a kingdom of desolation with nothing left to burn but his own shattered pride. The news traveled not with the speed of a galloping horse, but with the creeping, inexorable chill of a winter fog, seeping across the frontiers of Europe and into the gilded chambers of its capitals. The first fragmented reports of the Russian disaster were met with disbelief, then with a dawning savage satisfaction. In Berlin, the Prussian king, who had bowed his head to the continental system, now straightened his spine. The secret treaties of betrayal, long nurtured in the dark, were brought into the light. Prussia, a forced ally, defected with the cold precision of a calculated stab in the back, its armies beginning to stir with a newfound purpose, no longer Napoleon's shield in the east, but a sword pointed at his exposed flank. In Austria, old grudges were re-examined, and in the German states, long suppressed